Good afternoon. I'm Anu Rangarajan, Director of Mathematica Policy Research's International Research Division. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this forum sponsored by CIPRE, Center for International Policy Research and Evaluation. As part of Mathematica's mission to improve public well-being and to bring research and evidence to bear upon policy and decision-making, CIPRE sponsors forums which brings together donors, researchers, and other key stakeholders to discuss and share important evidence about, to discuss important evidence in issues related to development. The topic for today's forum is around grid electricity in Africa. More than half of Africa's population lacks electricity, and this figure is much higher for those who live in rural areas. Lack of access to electricity can affect education, health, and livelihoods. And donors are now investing huge amounts of funds to increase access to grid electricity in Africa, both to increase the generation of electricity and also to facilitate distribution and connection to those living in rural areas. With these large investments being made, it's important to learn about the extent to which households are indeed taking up these connections, whether access to electricity does improve well-being, whether these investments are cost-effective, and what alternative ways there are to ensure that people in rural areas get access to electricity. We're pleased to host a discussion today around these important issues. I'd now like to introduce Candace Miller, who's a senior researcher at Mathematica and is directing one of our evaluations of electricity infrastructure to moderate the discussion. Candace.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am delighted to see you all here today and to be a part of this panel. So as Anu said, my name is Candace Miller. I'm a senior researcher here at Mathematica. I have the pleasure to work with colleagues on the evaluation of the Tanzania energy sector evaluation. I'm also leading the Liberia energy sector evaluation. We are very pleased to have brought together an expert panel today with perspectives from both the donor community and the research community. From the donor perspective, Power Africa, with USAID and MCC and other partners, are investing hundreds of millions of dollars and catalyzing billions of dollars in public and private money to electrify Africa. From the research perspective, Mathematica and Research with Impact are working on key research and evaluation questions around grid and off-grid energy, renewables and non-renewables, implementation challenges, questions around regulation and utility company capacity, and also measuring outcomes at the level of households and small, medium, and large businesses. So we know that electrifying Africa and connecting millions of households and businesses across rural and urban areas in a cost-effective manner is an exceptionally complicated task. It's exceptionally complicated. And so today we have the opportunity to grapple with some of the challenges. So let me introduce the panel. First, Kathleen Auth, Deputy Energy Office Director and Grid Rollout Team Lead at Power Africa, will discuss the history of Power Africa, its current status, future plans, and areas where further rigorous evidence could inform both policy and planning. Duncan Chaplin is a senior researcher here at Mathematica. He will discuss evidence from our evaluation of the MCC's energy sector investments. Next, Jörg Peters, head of the research group on climate change at Research with Impact, will review evidence from other parts of Africa. And finally, our discussant, Shrina Patel, Director of Evaluation at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, will share MCC's perspective from the field. So at the end of Shrina's remarks, we'll open up the room for questions. And if you are joining us from the webinar, welcome. And you can submit a question through the QA widget at any time. So please note, we are recording today's session. So we ask that you silence all electronic devices. The video may pan around the room, so if you're not supposed to be here, then you may want to duck down. Just kidding. So now I'm happy to introduce Katie Ott.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen, or Katie Oth. I'm here from Power Africa, which is led by USAID. And first, I just want to thank Mathematica for bringing us all here together. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about Power Africa, and especially our work to connect people to the grid. So I wanted to start out with a brief introduction to Power Africa for those who may not be familiar with it. Power Africa is a US-led government initiative launched in 2014 to respond to this massive challenge that we're talking about today, which is that approximately 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to electricity. And for those that do have access, the electricity that they get is often either prohibitively expensive or very unreliable, and often both. And this acts as a major constraint on development across a number of sectors: education, healthcare, economic growth, stability. So for all of those reasons, the US government has identified this as both a development and a security priority for this country. The problem is that in order to achieve universal access in sub-Saharan Africa, it's been estimated that we would need approximately $835 billion. And traditionally in sub-Saharan Africa, this investment has been made by bilateral donors, by the World Bank and the AFDB and other kind of traditional development partners. There's just not enough public money in the world to do this. More importantly, we don't have to do this with public sector money alone, and in fact we shouldn't, because the private sector is eager and willing to invest in the power sector in Africa, as long as the risks, both real risks and perceived risks, can be mitigated. And that's where Power Africa sees its role. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to use limited public sector resources to crowd in much larger buckets of private capital. And we're now comprised of about 150 different entities, coordinated by USAID, but this includes 12 US government agencies and departments, about 140 private sector companies ranging from General Electric to very small kind of local African-led entrepreneurs and companies, as well as bilateral and multilateral partners like the World Bank and the AFDB. And we're bringing all these partners under one umbrella. Everyone's committed to expanding access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. And each entity brings a special set of resources and tools to the table. So if you look at just the US government partners, MCC, who Shrina's here today, MCC does large-scale infrastructure investments and utility turnaround platforms. The US Trade and Development Agency provides early-stage project support to generation facilities and pilot projects. And then OPIC and EXIM provide direct investment into major energy assets. And the State Department comes in with diplomacy and technical assistance. And then USAID provides a wide range of technical assistance that's focused on capacity building and strategic planning and all kinds of policy advice. Collectively, our goal is to, by 2030, facilitate the addition of 30,000 new megawatts of generating capacity and also 60 million new connections. So that means connecting 60 million new customers to a combination of central grids and then off-grid solutions that include solar home systems, but also mini-grids. And so far, in a little over 3 years that Power Africa has existed, we've brought over 7,000 megawatts to financial close, and we've connected 10 million new customers to electricity. So that impacts roughly 50 million people if you think about how many people are benefiting from a connection. Since today's discussion is focused on the access piece, I'm going to focus on that part of Power Africa's portfolio. Historically, African governments have been almost entirely focused on expanding access by building out their central grid networks. But now you're seeing the rapid growth of the off-grid sector, driven by nimble, innovative companies like M-COPA and B-Box and off-grid electric. And the advantages of off-grid solutions are that prices for solar panels and components are dropping dramatically, so that these systems are becoming available to even the poorest of rural populations. Secondly, the quality of the technologies themselves are actually rapidly improving, so that off-grid systems are able to provide more power at higher quality and often more reliably than what people are getting through the central grids. And then third, the products that off-grid companies are offering are scalable. So the family can start off with a small system that might be able to power a cell phone, and then they can gradually work their way up to a system that's powering much larger appliances. And with the efficiency gains that you're seeing in appliances, suddenly off-grid systems are able to power refrigeration and these kind of large-scale energy consumers. That being said, looking forward, there's still going to be a big need for the grid in sub-Saharan Africa. First, because there are enormous populations who are already living under existing distribution infrastructure who simply can't connect because it's too expensive or they're connected illegally. And these people can be connected quite cost effectively and quickly to the grid if we can address some of the barriers that they're facing. And secondly, with sub-Saharan Africa slated to experience the fastest and largest scale urbanization in the world over the next couple decades, those populations are going to continue increasing in size. So Power Africa recognizes that for dense, large consuming populations, the grid is still very cost effective and probably the best and quickest way, maybe not quickest, but something that will continue being very important. Lastly, traditional utilities, and this is really exciting, increasingly have opportunities to learn from the success that we're seeing in the off-grid sector. So you're seeing traditional utilities start to borrow from the mobile payment systems that off-grid companies are using. They're starting to figure out how can they be more nimble and customer-focused like the off-grid companies. And so that's a really exciting trend that we're starting to see. So recognizing that both on and off-grid solutions are going to have to play a role, Power Africa tries to optimize these. So we want to figure out how do we provide customers with the solutions that make the most sense for them, wherever they live, whatever they're consuming. How do we figure out what's the most cost-effective and appropriate solution and make that available? We also want to make sure that over the long term, we're helping build systems that are viable and commercially sustainable and can adapt as the power sector changes. In places where grid connection makes sense, we face a number of specific challenges. And that includes a couple different really interconnected things. First, expanding grid infrastructure is very capital intensive. And as utilities try to expand their grids outward from the cities, they're trying to connect increasingly dispersed and lower income populations, which is not very appetizing for these utilities, which are already struggling to recoup their costs. Second, government electrification plans are often based on political calculations rather than data-driven analysis. And so there may be reasons why the government is pushing the utility to connect this community rather than this one. And what that does is it prevents the utilities from being able to connect populations in sequences and at scales that make sense for their commercial survival. Third, they're using dilapidated infrastructure, and so they're losing a large amount of electricity. And they often don't have the capacity to accurately bill or collect from their consumers. So you're seeing massive losses with each customer that the utility adds. And then the tariffs that customers are asked to pay for electricity are often far below what's needed to cover costs. So the government feels that they need to provide power to people for very little money. And as a result, the utility cannot recoup its costs. And then finally, even when people live near the grid, they often can't connect because the upfront cost of connection is very, very high and can be actually equivalent to several months' worth of salaries. So they can't connect even if they wanted to, or they end up connecting illegally, which drives the utility further underwater. As a result of all these things coming together, you see that really only 2 utilities in sub-Saharan Africa recover their costs. And that is Umeme in Uganda, and then the utility in the Seychelles. Everywhere else, these utilities are losing money. And what that does is it creates a disincentive for them to add new customers, because every person that they connect to the grid is going to be an additional loss of money for them. And so we're looking at this system where to expand access, unless you solve some of these fundamental challenges, you're actually going to be driving these institutions further underwater, and you're going to be running the system as a whole into the ground. So recognizing that, Power Africa approaches this from a couple different directions. First, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, we focus on supporting integrated and data-driven electrification planning. So we help governments develop and implement strong electrification plans that maximize cost effectiveness and that also consider the interplay between on and off-grid solutions. So one of the exciting things you're seeing in this space is that, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, the government has just recently recognized that off-grid solutions need to play and can play a really huge role in their electrification future. And so they've actually asked Power Africa to come in and help them design a national strategy for off-grid. And similarly, we're working in Uganda to develop master plans for Uganda's rural service territories. So figuring out how can small-scale rural cooperatives actually serve people on a commercially viable basis. Second, we directly finance grid improvements where they're needed. And we can do this in a couple of ways. So for example, MCC is investing in a very large way in grid habilitation in countries like Benin, so strengthening grid infrastructure and improving service. And USAID is guaranteeing commercial loans to utilities. So for example, we guaranteed a loan from Standard Chartered Bank, who then loaned a large amount of capital to ZESCO, the utility in Zambia, which enabled ZESCO to build out its grid infrastructure and address a backlog of consumers who were trying to connect. Third, we want to address the fact that for many people, infrastructure isn't the real problem. It's the fact that they can't afford to connect to the grid. So some of the things that we're doing there is, again, USAID has applied loan guarantees. And basically, these are pretty innovative guarantees that guarantee on-lending to end users for the upfront cost of connection. And then in Cote d'Ivoire, we're actually looking at how we can pre-finance connections for the low-income households who want to be connected to the grid. And then they would pay back the connection cost over time. Finally, we help strengthen utilities themselves so that they can improve their operations, reduce their losses, and actually be functional, commercially viable entities. And so again, MCC is playing a huge role in this through their utility turnaround programs in countries like Ghana. USTDA is helping utilities like in Nigeria pilot really advanced metering solutions that are reducing losses and helping improve their performance. And then the State Department is hosting a partnership exchange where they're actually bringing African CEOs together with American CEOs of utilities so that they can discuss as peers some of these really systemic problems and how they can address them. Before I wrap up, I wanted to end, given Mathematica's kind of research and data focus, with some of the key questions that we think are critical as we look to expand our grid connection program. So the first is, given how systemic these issues are and how interconnected all of these various factors are, we're constantly looking at where and in what sequence can we intervene to have the greatest impact. And that's a really hard question for us to answer. The second is, where do incentive structures need to be changed? So I talked about the fact that often these utilities have absolutely no incentive to connect new customers because that will increase the money that they're losing. So how do we change those incentives? How do we look at making sure that the incentive structures are appropriately structured so that we can all kind of move forward together? Third, what political considerations are in play? So I think often people tend to view this as a largely technical problem where we can come in and invest in infrastructure and modern utility services and meters, but really that often doesn't address the political calculations that African governments are making about who should be prioritized for access, the targets that they're setting because they feel pressure coming into elections, all of those kinds of soft factors that often don't get taken into account. And then fourth, what data is available to inform electrification planning and the optimization of that on and off grid mix that I talked about. So I think this is a space where I'm sure Sharina will talk about it a bit. MCC is doing really interesting analysis in that space, as are many others. But we want to continue increasing the degree to which we can collectively identify the populations that really make sense for grid connection, and where grid connection doesn't make sense, how can we scale up the use of high-quality off-grid systems and make sure that we accelerate the achievement of universal access. And that's it. I'd like to turn it over to Duncan, I believe, for his presentation.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent introduction to this session. Let's see, how is that? Better? Excellent. So thank you so much, Katie, for introducing that. That's going to help me get through my slides much more quickly. I'm going to be talking about our work evaluating MCC's energy sector work in Tanzania. List of co-authors here on our final report, but really there was a lot of Mathematica staff involved on many of the different reports we did and also in the background. And also, MCC played a major role, including Shrina Patel, who will be speaking here later today, who was our project officer for quite a while. So, for those of you who don't know, MCC works by basically giving grants, large-scale grants to governments who've performed well in the past. And Tanzania got a large one, $700 million in 2008, and they chose to use that for roads, water, and energy. We're going to talk today primarily about two components of the energy project, one focused on line extensions to extend the electric grid, and the second on low-cost connection offers to help households connect to those lines. So our evaluation questions, we're going to be focusing first on the impacts we'd expect to be largest, which is on actually connecting. Turns out the impacts are fairly modest. And so we wouldn't expect large impacts on a lot of other outcomes. And so to help inform future research and future interventions, we were thinking we'll go and look at the impact of actually connecting, because we have a lot of rich data. And so we use that to estimate how does actually connecting affect outcomes. The line extensions were done in a large number of regions, seven regions of Tanzania. We're only going to be covering 6 today. And the rationale is pretty straightforward. Very few Tanzanians in rural areas have access to these lines. Now, the initiative was done in a way that I think follows up on what Katie was saying to try and be cost effective. So they didn't just pick communities everywhere. They went towards where the lines already were and just building the lines out a little bit in each direction. And then they were trying to look for communities where there could be a lot of people who might connect. So sort of getting at the costs, how much new line will be needed, and the benefits, how many people might connect. There were over 300 communities selected for new lines. We randomly selected 178 to try and give us a representative picture of those communities. And then we used some very rich data, both from census, and then we went and surveyed about more than 500 communities and selected 182 that were best matched using that survey data. Over 2,500 kilometers of line were built. Low-cost connection offers, the rationale is pretty straightforward. Katie's already alluded to this. Very high connection costs in Africa. This is the amount of money you pay directly to the utility in order to get connected. And so, now we might look at these fees and think it's no big deal, but for African households, in the rural areas especially, these are very high costs. The initiative lowered it to about $20. So that's an 80% reduction in the rural areas. It's even a 90% reduction roughly in the urban areas. Evaluation was focused only on those communities that were targeted to get new lines. We randomly picked 27 of those to get these low-cost connection offers, and all households in those communities were given those offers. Very rich data for this study. We had baseline surveys of over 10,000 households in 360 communities. And we only focused on the households that were not connected and were not within 30 meters of the existing line. Forgot to mention, about a third of the communities did have some lines. Obviously, not enough to connect all households, but they did have some. And so we were just selecting the households that were not near to those lines. Follow-up, 4 years later, we've got about 9,000 households in 360 communities. 20 to 24 months after the new lines were completed, 14 to 24 months after the low-cost connections were offered. So that gave households time to make connections and to actually benefit. Obviously, an even longer-term follow-up would be great, but this was certainly much better than doing it right after the intervention. The connection rates I alluded to earlier, we do see big impacts in the sense of the line extensions almost doubled connection rates from about 11% to 21%. You might be going, what's that 11%? Why is anybody connecting in those comparison communities? There were a lot of other lines being built. There was other sources of funding. And so a lot of the comparison communities did get new lines as well. Low-cost connection offers, also pretty big impacts in the sense that it moved from 18 percentage points up to 31. So a 13 percentage point shift. However, that's only a third of the households still. Even in the communities that got the lines, that got the low-cost connections, you're still seeing less than a third of households actually connecting. So that's why we look at the impacts of actually connecting. That'll help inform future policies where you might get higher connection rates. Got to think about how you're going to get those higher connection rates, but if you do, these impacts might tell you something about what the benefits could be. So our treatment group here was households that connected either to MCC or non-MCC lines, and our comparison group was non-connected households in the communities with and without the lines. We obviously had to worry about bias. The households were presumably, if we just randomly picked them, wouldn't have been the same at baseline, but we had a lot of this rich baseline data. We could control at both the household and community levels, and we did a number of tests for bias that are detailed in our report, and found no evidence of bias. We expected biggest impacts on use of other forms of energy. So two, in this slide, use of actually owning a generator. A lot of wealthy households, relatively well-off households own generators. And then using dry cells. So the households were using a lot of batteries. The dry cells is another word for batteries. And that went down when they got connected. We were also interested in the idea that pollution could be affected. We didn't measure pollution directly, we measured it indirectly by looking at solid and liquid fuels and the types of appliances people were using. And we knew there was basically two things going on. One is kerosene for lighting, and the other is wood and charcoal for cooking. We already knew we wouldn't see much in the way of cooking. A lot of research has been done where they go into rural communities and a lot of the wood is free. People can still, even though deforestation is a huge issue, people can still get access to free wood. And so we didn't expect to see much of a shift there, and we didn't. That's too bad, because that's a major source of pollution. What we were expecting to see impacts on kerosene. So that was a very expensive way of lighting. Households, a lot of rural households were doing this traditionally. We didn't see impacts. I was worried. I was like, oh my gosh, we must have made a wording error, the survey, something's wrong. But we looked around in the research areas, in the previous literature, and we discovered work by Jorg and his colleagues showing that, in fact, a lot of African rural communities have shifted away from kerosene towards batteries. And so that is probably what explains our finding, that a lot of the households that were electrifying in our study had already shifted to batteries, and now when they got grid electricity, they just reduced their battery use, but not their kerosene use. There's other important benefits. As Katie mentioned, education is a key one. And we do see important impacts there, kids increasing their hours of studying at night by about 50%, from 0.41 hours to 0.6 hours. And there's no reduction during the day. So the total hours of studying went up. And that's a very positive finding. And there's a number of research studies in Africa showing similar results. But there's another finding that you want to keep in mind, and it depends on your view about TV. I think there's conflicting evidence. Huge, huge impact on TV. So more than an hour extra per day of TV watching. And obviously that might have benefits, but a lot of parents, certainly in the US, would be concerned about that much extra TV. So that, I think, is at least a word of caution there. And you'd want to maybe dig into that further, figure out what the kids are watching. And also, the way we actually asked the question, they could have claimed they were studying and watching TV at the same time. Obviously, kids in the US will claim that, and you might be a little skeptical. We looked at a lot of outcomes related to economic well-being, and definitely found impacts there. Now, the bar on this graph looks small, but it's actually close to $1,000 per year, which is a very large amount for a rural African household. The problem is it's teeny compared to the cost. And that's just the cost of building these lines. So that's cause for concern. Over $6,000 per household to build these lines, per connected household. Why is that? Basically, MCC's contractor had calculated that they would get a lot more connections. They expected about 35,000 connections, and they only got about 11,000. So now, when you divide the total amount spent by 11,000, that ratio is much bigger because the denominator is so small. Why are the connection rates so low? Katie's alluded to some of this, so I'll try to whip through the stuff she already discussed. But the line placement is a huge issue. And one basic thing is you're connecting from one rural village to another. You got to put that line in between. Well, there's very, very few people living in between. So right there, you've got a bunch of lines that aren't near anybody. And then you get into the village, and you might discover, gee, it's hard to get between some of these houses. We're just going to go along the road. That's where it's easy to put the line up. Households might not always be there. And then last but not least, sometimes these households are not thrilled about having a pole put right in their front yard. And so the utility tries to negotiate, and in the end they just give up and say, we're just going to put the poles out in the field because there's one guy that owns the field and he gave us permission. And so those, again, the lines might not be near the households. And that was definitely an issue in our study. Utility capacity, they're underfunded, their incentives are wrong, and so again, getting those connections made can be a challenge. Customer costs, we did the low-cost connection offer. That reduced the amount the household had to pay to the utility, but the household's also required to wire their house. The utility won't connect the household unless they've fixed up the wiring. And that wiring cost can be hundreds of dollars as well. And so that was a major constraint for a lot of households. Last but not least, customer awareness. I'm just going to give you one example. There's many areas where customers might not be aware of the process or to get electricity or of the benefits. But one particular thing in Tanzania was something called a ready board, which was designed to be an alternative to the expensive wires. A household would get something about this big where they could just plug in a few light bulbs and maybe an iron. But it was much cheaper than wiring. And so we thought this would be a great thing, and the Tanzanian government's been pushing, or the utility's been pushing this for years. In our study, almost nobody used it. Almost nobody was even aware of it. So it really is a major problem. And we think that maybe what's going on is the people most likely to be talking to them about this would be the people who install the wiring, and for them, there's really no benefit. So they might kind of downplay, say, oh, no, you don't want that thing. We're not sure. But anyhow, that definitely did not happen. So brief summary. The impacts on connection rates were modest compared to the goals. The cost, and this meant that cost per connection was very high. The impacts on household income are there. It does seem to improve it. And we found that even if you look at $1 or $2 rates of poverty. So it's not just at the upper end. It's people at all levels of income. There are other benefits of electrification. We found some in education. And I didn't mention safety. The perception of safety improved a lot for households in electrified communities at night. The light at night seems to help. But you might wonder, is that really going to be enough to justify that cost? So really, it seems like getting those connection rates up is going to be huge, and figuring out how to do that's going to matter. Future research, thinking about how to measure connection rates over time. They do generally improve, we think, although the research in this area is kind of fuzzy. But we think we've got some ideas for how that could be done well. To figure out, do the connection rates in these communities go up over time once households have time to save up the connection fee? That could matter. Related point is those education benefits. We'd really like to see how those play out over time. And we've also been pursuing some ideas of how that might be done. Reduce the wiring costs. I mentioned that ready board concept and the better information to get there. And then last but not least, improving the incentives for the utilities. You really got to get their cost structure and the amounts they're allowed to charge aligned with their costs. Okay, thank you. So I'll now introduce Jorg, who will take us through the rest of Africa.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, it's great to be here also because usually, so I'm used to being the messenger of somewhat sobering results on the impact of electrification, and in that case, it feels more like preaching to the converted. Yeah, but so let me maybe complement these two great interventions by so actually it was Duncan's study, or the Mathematica study in Tanzania that that brought us together, right? And it's a great study. It's very detailed, and so we have done similar studies, not as big as that one, but more than that, than just one. And that's also the evidence that kind of informs this talk now. And I kind of have a more look from a bird view, if you want, now. And I basically the ambition of the next 14.5 minutes is to make a claim for rethinking the electrification master plan. And this is what Katie also called, we have to optimize the mix between on-grid and off-grid. So I've got 4 key messages for you. Of course, we could talk for hours, but I've got only now 40 minutes left. So 4 key messages, and they are coming from our work that we have done in the last 10, 11 years all over Africa, many countries in Africa, in different regions of the continent on various technologies in the energy access sector, so cook stoves also. But then our topic today is electrification. So we studied off-grid technologies, off-grid solar, but also mini-grids, and also in a few countries also grid extension programs. So this is the evidence that that forms the basis of these 4 key messages, and here they are. So the first message is, and that's an optimistic one. The next 3 ones are a bit more sobering then. So the optimistic one is electricity has a high priority for the rural poor. And the second one is that consumption levels in connected areas, and that also follows up to what Duncan showed, are very low. And then again, Duncan has provided some evidence on that also. Impacts on economic development in a narrower sense, so firm creation and these kind of things, are very modest. And then the 4th point is that on-grid electrification is rarely cost-effective. Yeah, and then we'll now try to provide some substance to these messages. This is now for the first point, and it's a picture I took on my breakfast table a few weeks ago. It's the title page of Germany's biggest newspaper, and it's not coming from Africa, obviously, neither the journal nor the picture. So it's showing a Rohingya refugee who is who has just entered Bangladesh. So he has just left or was forced to leave his home, and he is still carrying his solar home system, as you see. So he's carrying his belongings, his most precious belongings, as you might say, including his baby and some pots. And then also, among these few things, also the solar home system of his family. And this, in a very sad way, it shows, in a way, it's a revealed preference, as economists say, and it shows the priority electricity has for the rural poor. And so we have also tried to probe into this in a more, let's say, rigorous academic way, and what economists do, that when they want to study the priority or preference of people, they go for the willingness to pay, and this we have done in a couple of countries, and this is one example from Rwanda, where we elicited the revealed willingness to pay for different off-grid technologies. And what you see here, or what these bars show, is the share of monthly expenditures that people were actually willing so effectively they also paid, right? So this is a revealed willingness to pay thing. So they paid these kind of shares of their monthly expenditures, and this indicates how important it is for them, right? So even for a small, just a lantern, they were ready to make available 20% of their monthly expenditures, and it goes up to more than 300% for a full-fledged solar home system, which provides a couple of light bulbs and the radio and maybe even a small television set. But here we have to emphasize or make clear that this does not mean that that this willingness to pay is enough to reach the market prices, right? So they're barely able to pay cost-covering prices, and this is why M-Copper and these kind of success cases in the off-grid sector. For sure, they are successful. That's nothing I doubt. It's just that they provide off-grid solar to, let's say, the better off 10-20% of the society, and these approaches, which are supposed to be cost covering, they will not reach the rural poor, right? So this is also like a side note within this first message. The second one, is that consumption levels in connected areas and rural areas, so this is on-grid now, are extremely low. And this is coming from Rwanda, again. And as you see, I don't know if you can see these numbers. So basically, this graph shows that something like 80–90% of connected people are consuming less than 20 kilowatt hours a month, which is basically nothing, just a few light bulbs. And this is also what we see then in various surveys in different countries, that households only use it for lighting and radio, of course, and sometimes also television sets, but that's it. So it's never used for cooking, as Duncan also pointed out, and neither for refrigeration or ironing and these kind of things. So these kind of higher power appliances. And these are clearly services that can be easily also provided by individual off-grid solar technologies. The third point, and this is in many audiences the most provocative one, maybe not so much in that one, thanks to Duncan's intervention, and this is the impacts on economic development are very modest, also in grid extension programs, and not just after a year, but also after 4, 5, or 7, 8 years. So we have done that in some countries, or well, in 1 or 2, also in the somewhat longer term. So even after 7, 8 years, you hardly see like business activities, firm creation. So all this it happens in exceptional cases. You do see like some success anecdotes if you want, but systematically it does not happen, and certainly not to a degree that that would satisfy the respective donor, or the government that has made the investment. And the reason for that, like, of course, in a very superficial way now, is that electricity is not the main bottleneck, and this is in contrast to what many donors and governments think. It does not set free like potential that have been hidden before. And the reason for that again is that access to like supra-regional markets, let's call them like this, are extremely is extremely limited in most parts of rural Africa, right? So enterprises just produce whatever they produce for the local market and not for some sort of export to like towns or cities, or let alone the international market. And this is, I think, the major reason why we don't observe important impacts on economic development in whatever sense. And then another side note also is that if it exists, in cases, of course, you do have, like, for example, resource extraction or agricultural processing for products that are supposed to be exported, or tea, for example, or coffee. So if that exists, then this is already exploited also before the grid arrives by generators. Of course, they are more expensive than the grid, that's for sure, but still it's not like a physical, natural, limitation to what people can do also without the grid. And then another point that is also important in other areas of the regions of the world, in India, for example, we have seen in the 70s and in the 80s when they rolled out the grid that it was used for irrigation, and you hardly see that. Well, basically, I've never seen that in Africa. So people hardly use electric pumps. This is also important. As a disclaimer, this is probably the most populist slide I've done in my academic career. So it shows the costs of different technologies. So the first three are, as you see, off-grid technologies, and these are basically just the market prices, and they go up from something between like $10–15 for a small lantern, which only provides lighting, and then 35 for a device that provides lighting and the USB charger to charge the cell phone, which is an important service for people in rural Africa. They all have cell phones. And for this full-fledged solar home system, which I mentioned already earlier, you might pay something between like $150 or like $300–400, depending on, of course, on the size again. But this one is enough to provide a couple of electricity for a couple of light bulbs and a radio, television set, something like this. And compared to this, as Duncan also pointed out, the grid connection cost per household goes through the roof. Right? That's the populist part now. So this number now, 1,500, that's coming from Rwanda. But it can easily go up to whatever, like 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, depending on the connection rates in these newly connected areas. I actually think in most places of Rwanda, connection costs will be as high as in Duncan's study, or even higher, because connection rates are often just somewhere between 10 and 20%, right? Yeah, so these 4 points, I hope they kind of complement what Katie also said. So we have to think about optimizing the mix between off-grid and on-grid electrification, and so I think it's important, or it's fair to say that, you know, whatever the true costs of grid extension are, and also the true benefits, which, you know, it's of course difficult to estimate what will happen in the long run and all this, but it's probably safe to say that it's not reasonable to connect every single village in rural Africa, which in many countries is the current policy. So if they electrify, then they basically extend the grid. At the same time, given the SE for All, this is the UN initiative, you know, that basically proclaims to connect or serve everybody with electricity by 2030. So given that we have these international goals, and also given the high priority of, you know, that electricity has for the rural poor, and of course, given the limitations to public budgets, we have to think about an electrification master plan. That's how I've labeled it, in a bit more dramatic way than just optimizing the mix, as Katie put it. And this master plan has to be pro-poor, right? And I think the current policy is not pro-poor, and of course more cost-effective. Right, and I think this master plan should contain something like, so we have to identify those regions. So of course we cannot just only go for off-grid solar. That will not be the solution. But we have to think about where to where to build the grid. And this, I think, is a very challenging task. And I hope, and I think that socio-economic research can contribute to this by doing some sort of smart demand forecast, survey-based demand forecasts, which is not trivial, right? Because it's obviously difficult to see what happens once you build infrastructure. But I think we have to think about improving our toolkit on that node. And then, for the vast majority, it will not be possible to reach them with the grid for the named reasons. And here, I think, given that, as I said, in most cases they will not be able to pay cost-covering prices for off-grid solar. And here, I think our claim is that there is a case to subsidize off-grid solar, for at least for the poorest trader. And again, here, this is a very bold statement, of course, and it's easier said than done. And here we have to invest into, or think about how to develop, smart subsidy schemes in order to avoid genie out of the bottle effects that we have seen in other places and cases. And I think that's hopefully the agenda for the next years. Thank you.
So I'm just going to make a few remarks sitting over here. From the donor perspective, and also from our perspective, just kind of reflecting on the literature and the learning that has come out of our own evaluations. And so just for a little bit more background, MCC has or is currently investing in large power programs in 9 countries. And in Africa, so Tanzania has closed, but that's Benin, Malawi, Ghana, Liberia, and I think in Sierra Leone as well. And Mathematica has been a great partner for us in many of these evaluations, and is continuing to, is basically launching at least 3 newer evaluations in this space. And so we're very excited to continue working with Mathematica on that. I think we've seen some common themes emerging from all 3 presentations, and many of those themes are things that MCC has been reflecting on, particularly since the Tanzania evaluation results came out last year. And so, to be clear, I mean, Duncan talked about the impacts that the team found from connecting to electricity, but he also did mention, and I just want to emphasize, that we really found no impacts from MCC's investment. So, $128 million investment in extending distribution lines, we didn't find impacts even on electricity consumption, let alone, or even going further to economic impact. So that was a very sobering experience for us. Only a third of the connections that we had expected to connect, and that expectation was thought to happen soon after the lines were energized. Even 3 years after that, we still only found about a third, about 11,000, as Duncan said, households had connected. So definitely a moment of reflection for us and disappointment for us. And but I think what came out of that was just topics that the other presenters have talked about. And one what is kind of the need for thinking about policy and institutional reform. So yes, we built some nice infrastructure in that was all kind of fine. The project went as it was planned, but whether that infrastructure connected well with the rest of TANESCO's network, whether the households were still experiencing outages on those lines, even though the lines themselves were functioning okay, meaning the management of the system was resulting in outages, we didn't anticipate and we didn't really measure very well either. So we can't say too well why households weren't connecting. Was it that they were? We have some ideas about it, but we don't know whether it was also just lack of trust in the utility, TANESCO, and or just poor operations from TANESCO for connecting households or communicating to households about whether they could use ready boards or have to wire their entire house. And so if you were to look at MCC's newer power investments, such as in Malawi, Ghana, Benin, we have a much larger focus on the institutional aspects of these investments. And so we will no longer simply have an infrastructure component to the investment. They'll always be coupled by policy and institutional reform, working with the utilities, working generally on the energy sector master plan, and so on and so forth. And so that's been a big shift for us. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, which Jorg talked about at the end of his presentation, is we really want to understand better what is the demand curve for electricity or for connecting to electricity. And I think now there's a lot more literature out there, including the study in Kenya by the team out of UC Berkeley, and I think various other studies, including our own, which we may consider continuing and doing another round of. It's really critical to just understand. I think we know now that it's not a given that once you provide electricity especially to rural communities, that they will automatically connect. And we expect that there may be an S-curve to that demand curve, but we don't really understand, what the shape of that curve looks like. And so I think we now always do willingness to pay surveys ahead of our investments to inform the design of our investments, and I think we might consider doing those more intensively or doing them at Nline as well to try to map out basically the demand curve. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was just evaluation-specific learning. So something that came out of Tanzania was, we fielded, as Duncan said, we had a very rich data set. We had a big baseline, and we fielded a very big end line as well. And through that survey, we found only a third of the households that we had expected to connect actually connected. And so, of course, as Duncan mentioned, we didn't find, or unsurprisingly, I shouldn't say of course, but unsurprisingly, we didn't find the impacts on the outcomes of interest. And so what we learned from that is we really need to understand what's happening on the grid better so that we could have seen, maybe these lines were energized, but they're not actually, that what we had expected to happen didn't actually happen. And so maybe we don't need to go ahead and measure all of these longer-term outcomes that are very unlikely to manifest. And so we've been heavily just thinking much more carefully about how we get better information about what's happening on the grid through smart meters, and we're also piloting in Ghana mobile phone technology to get an independent measure of outages. At least the pilot is in Accra. And so that's another component to the evaluations. I think MCC's mission is poverty reduction through economic growth, so we will continue to try to measure the economic impacts of our programs, but we're trying to be a little bit smarter about making sure we understand what's happening more closely to the investment before jumping ahead to effects on households and businesses. Thanks.
All right, thank you, everyone. for your comments. All right, so that's a sobering donor and research perspective. So what we're going to do now is open up the floor for audience questions, and Carmen will share questions from webinar participants. If you're in the room and you have a question, please state your name and your affiliation, and make sure that the microphone is on so that those who watch by video or are on the webinar will be able to hear you. Are you, okay. All right, let me start actually with a question. And my question first, I think for Kathleen. So because I've had the opportunity to work on the Tanzania project and see some of the differences in the compacts with Liberia and Ghana, I have a better sense of some of the things that Shrina was talking about how those compacts are different and all the work that's happening at the utility level, the work that's happening at the policy level, the regulatory work that's happening. Can you talk a little bit from the Power Africa perspective about how data and evidence and these new studies are informing the way that you are doing your work?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think we've learned a lot from the lessons that MCC has taken away from its compacts. And when I say we, I'm talking about Power Africa writ large, which is obviously an interagency effort. So we're kind of coordinating this much larger set of activities that's being done by the entire US government. And I think the great thing about Power Africa is that there's really strong interagency collaboration, which has enabled us to learn from what MCC has experienced. It also means that we're able to bring together the skill sets that the various agencies provide. So when we're working on expanding access in a particular country, we're very conscious of the fact that obviously you can't just connect a household and expect the world to be better. That you have to be coupling that with really strong institutional engagement at the utility, with the regulator, with the Rural Electrification Agency, that the planning has to be right, that we need to get the financing straight. And I think we're trying to do that very much so by bringing in all of the tools and resources that we collectively have as the US government. And I think we are actually very hungry for the quantitative data demonstrating what the impacts of electricity access are. And I think even though you can look at the numbers that Duncan presented and take away a very negative understanding of that, I actually don't think it's negative. I think it shows not that connection isn't good. I think it shows that we haven't been doing it right. And so if we can figure out how to do our work more effectively, taking into account these policy and institutional barriers, I think that picture will change, hopefully, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. And just to kind of add on to that, it's thinking about the TV, the increase in TV. And I remember when we were doing some of the qualitative work in Tanzania and hearing from women, we were doing focus groups with men and women, and the women were talking about their increased television watching, and this was a tremendous thing for them. They thought this was fantastic. They could do their work in the morning, they could watch TV in the afternoon. They were doing this with other women in the area, and this really made, in their perspective, this made their lives better. This was a real improvement. And I had mentioned to Jorg, hearing from this older man who could have been my grandpa, and he had lights for the first time in his house, and he was saying, when the light goes on in your house, it's like the light goes on in your head, and you're connected to the world. And so you think of, okay, so you've got this exposure through TV, you've got this this new sense of feeling connected to the world. So maybe it takes 5 years, maybe it takes 10 years, maybe it takes longer for economic development. So maybe the timeline and the way we're asking things and what we're measuring is something we want to think more about and continue to dig into. One other thing that was very interesting to hear was going to health centers and hearing about You know, no longer were you delivering a child in the middle of the night by cell phone and hoping the battery doesn't die, but now you're doing it with lights, and the medicines are in refrigeration and things like that. So some of these different benefits that we haven't necessarily talked about before today, but they are documented and important to consider. Are there any questions in the audience? Okay, we'll just let the, oh, actually, sorry, Arvin, you had the mic. I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
No, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes?
Great. First, I wanted to thank everyone who was speaking today. This was a very, very informative discussion for me. I'm not an energy expert. And I also really appreciate the candor of the discussion. It's really great that we're acknowledging all the challenges that are out there. That seems like the first step in getting things done. So that's great. When I'm listening, I'm hearing sort of a demand-side mystery and a supply-side mystery that I have questions about. So, you know, on one hand, we have very connect new folks. So that's a bit of a puzzle to me. So on the utility side, I'm wondering, you know, the first thing I think is, oh, gee, we need to get to scale. You know, we need to get to having enough customers that it's actually cheap to have customers in. But if at least in the short term, you're seeing utilities losing money each time they add someone, what are some of the hypotheses? What can be done on the supply side to actually encourage us to get to that scale? So that's on the supply side. And on the demand side, there's a simpler question, which is, even when we saw low connection rates, we saw not very much uptake. So what are some of the hypotheses on that side? What's preventing people from uptake?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's true. So from both sides, there are problems. I don't think so. So it's certainly not helpful that utilities are making losses with every kilowatt hour. I don't think this is helpful, but I don't think that this is the reason why they are not reluctant to connect, because the policy pressure in most countries is very high. I mentioned, it has a very high priority for the rural population, and this is also why politicians are eager to connect them if possible. So I don't think there is this is like the major reason why we have supply side problems. And then on the demand side, yeah, what impedes them from consuming more? I think, well, the simple answer is poverty, right, and no possibilities to gain money by using appliances that might help them, whatever, to improve their employment opportunities. Yeah, and then of course they are extremely budget restricted, and I think that's the main reason for that.
Add something briefly on top of that. I'm wondering to what extent there's work thinking about how to coordinate roads, water, and other ways to promote business beyond just electricity. So I could imagine, if you take a rural community and you give them electricity, but the roads and water are no good, it could be very difficult to build good businesses. And it seems to me that might be an important area to be coordinating when and developing these projects.
Sure.
On the utility question, I think the difficult thing about it is that there are like 1,000 different factors contributing to that those utility losses. And so I think there's a strategic planning perspective, which is what Jörg was referring to in terms of, first we should just make sure that the grid companies, the utility companies, are focused on connecting the customers that are the most cost effective. So dense, highly populated areas where they're going to be able to connect a bunch of people will make it cheaper per connection for them to do that infrastructure build out. But then secondly, what's happening is effectively the utilities get caught in like a downward spiral. So they're getting political pressure that keeps end user tariffs really, really low. So they're not collecting enough money. That means that they can't invest or maintain their infrastructure, which means that the quality of service goes down, which means that customers are then less willing to pay for a grid connection because they're not getting any power out of it. And so you get this kind of spiral that goes down and down and down. One of the sobering things I heard from a utility recently was that they're basically only able to do basic maintenance on like 20% of their system, which means that, you know, very rapidly their entire grid infrastructure is deteriorating, which means that they're losing more electricity out of inefficiencies and all kinds of things. So I think the tough part is like, how do you wrangle all those problems and lift the system as a whole out of its death spiral? And I think that's I don't have an answer to that, but I think we're trying to attack that from many different angles.
Yeah, and I would just add that that's essentially what MCC's hypothesis is now, which addresses to some extent both the supply and demand side issues, and that's precisely why we are working with, we basically want to try to get these utilities to be solvent. And I mean, that's an ambitious undertaking in 5 years for our 5-year grants, but still, we're trying to pick pieces in each of these countries that we think we might be able to change. And in addition, I don't think we have any access projects or grid extension programs anymore. We're rehabilitating, and so we're just trying to reinforce parts of the network and the grid that are particularly problematic, so that we're not, like in Tanzania, saddling the utility with underperforming lines that they now have to maintain when they couldn't even maintain the grid that they already had.
Yeah, and there's a role certainly for donor coordination, right, with many different governments coming to the table for rehabilitation and new infrastructure. A lot of times there are systems that don't necessarily fit together, and you need different machinery, technology, and capacity in order to maintain these lines, and that can be very difficult. I think another thing that we see both in Tanzania and hearing about it a lot in Liberia right now is that last mile. So Liberia has excess generation. Customers have filled out applications and they want to be connected, but the electricians, I think Duncan mentioned that earlier, there aren't the electricians to actually connect the households to the lines, and that was something we certainly saw in Tanzania, where people were ready, they had paid, but there was no local electrician. So not only the utility companies, but also that kind of vocational education in order for electricians to be ready to roll when the customer has filled out their application. And the other thing is, if you think of customer service in some of these countries, a utility's ability not only to maintain lines, but to receive applications, to go in a timely manner, to to kind of do all of that retail part of electricity is an extreme challenge. All right, Carmen, you want to take a webinar question?
Yes. Actually, before I take the webinar question, I wanted to remind the panelists to feel free to keep your mics on during this portion of the presentation. This question comes from Jay Taneha. His question is, why aren't national utilities deploying more solar home systems rather than expensive grid connections?
Are they? So my experience is that they don't. So off-grid solar is in some cases, but hardly, I would say, promoted by the utility itself, and even not by the government, but rather by some sort of non-governmental organizations, I would say. So actually, utilities are very much focused on, because this is the business that they know to do, on grid extension.
I'd say there are some innovative ideas out there for how you could make money selling solar panels and stuff, where you would pay just part of the cost up front, maybe even a very small fraction, and then you pay a user fee. And I think these businesses are using some remote sensing stuff to figure out how much the consumer is using the product and whether they're paying. And if they stop paying, it stops working. So it's a very clever system. Whether utilities would want to get into that business or not, I don't know, but there are businesses doing this now.
Yeah, and I would add that there are some countries that technically have the legal and regulatory framework to allow for what's called net metering. So, in the U.S., you might see a house that has a grid connection, but that also has a solar panel, and that's kind of reducing your need to buy power from the utility. Ghana, for example, technically allows for that, but the problem is that kind of integration of distributed solar is very difficult for the utilities to manage, and so often they don't have the capacity to handle kind of the influx of distributed solar, or they're just nervous about doing it. And the other thing is that, unfortunately, a lot of these utilities in Africa are state-owned institutions. They're very hierarchical. They're very bureaucratic. They're not nimble. They're not innovative. And so, they are used to extending the grid, as you're alluded to. And so I think they're not necessarily adaptive. But I think moving forward, we'd like to get them to the point where they're able to adapt some of these better technologies and think a little bit more creatively about reaching customers.
Okay, I think there's a question up here in the front row.
Hi, my name is Efia Owusu-Fofie. I was born in Ghana. I lived there, till I was 23 before I moved here. My affiliation, I used to work here. And then I'm currently with Deloitte & Touche as a risk analytics consultant, but it's more of personal interest. That's why I'm attending their seminar. I want to hear more about the pilot mobile technologies that you were talking about. And I believe, Kathleen, you were also talking about this mix of African CEOs and American CEOs and maybe some of the agenda that they're talking about. I was also wondering how someone can have practical access to some of the work that MCC or USAID is doing. Does your work translate into alternative vendors on the market? I wanted to understand a little bit more about that. And also, I think a lot has been said about, people that can access and people that cannot afford. But growing in Ghana, up in Ghana, our alternative was always, if the lights went off, my dad had a generator. So for those people that do have access, could you elaborate more on some of those percentages? Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Sure, I can talk very briefly about the Ghana pilot. Essentially what the team is doing is trying to get an independent assessment of outages in Accra. And I know Jay, who just asked the question, is part of the team who's working on this, so I don't want to get the details wrong. But basically, a group of academics have developed a mobile phone app that can detect outages. And so what we're piloting is the number of phones that we need to have downloaded that app, and the placement, the locations around the city, et cetera, such that we can get a reliable estimate, and reliable independent estimate of outages that we can then triangulate with the utility data. There's further sort of research questions that could follow from that. What do you do with that data? What happens if you make it public? What happens if you share it with the utility, and so on and so forth. But right now, we're just trying to really just test this technology to measure outages.
And then, I'm happy to talk more about the utility exchange. So it was launched last April. It's being hosted by the State Department, the U.S. State Department. It brought together, I think, 5 African CEOs in its initial phase. They're hoping to scale it up over time, but we started out with 6. And then brought in a number of CEOs from American utilities, but also Canadian utilities. And we brought them all together for a couple days of workshopping. And I was lucky enough to be able to participate. And what was really interesting about it was that seeing the utility CEOs kind of interact as peers, the conversation and the tenor of the discussion was much different than the discussion that these same individuals may have with donors or with other institutions. And so I kind of just it was great to sit quietly and just take it all in and be a fly on the wall, because they were being very candid about these really difficult challenges that they face. And surprisingly, one of the key things that kept coming up and what the CEOs from African utilities were most interested in was how to deal better with their customers. So they were really interested in learning from American utilities about how do we be more transparent? How do we provide customers with better information? How do we be better at communicating why we need to raise tariffs? Often African countries try to raise tariffs to something approaching cost reflectiveness, and there are riots in the streets. So the utilities were interested in how do we communicate with people why we need to raise prices and why it's important, and that was really interesting. And the CEO of Gridco was one of the people that was there. So I can, if you come up later and give me an email, I'll send you more information. And then I'm not quite sure what your second question was about access to materials, but I know there's a ton of MCC and Power Africa stuff online. Yeah.
Oh, do you have the, sorry, I'm the mic police.
So the question wasn't geared more towards, maybe slides or extra information, but in terms of an actual product, like if I wanted to get access to electricity, like what kind of vendors do these work power? So that in addition to, let's say, I know the Electricity Corporation of Ghana provides electricity. Does the work that USAID and MCC is doing, does that eventually lead to, I guess, other alternatives on the markets, or it's strictly just working with, I guess, maybe government-owned entities like the ECG?
No, we cross the spectrum. So in Ghana, for example, MCC is leading the charge on working with ECG, and that's obviously a huge segment of Ghana's power sector. But we're also working with the private sector off-grid companies, so solar home system companies and mini-grid operators, and providing them with capital and business support and all kinds of assistance to help them scale their models too. So we work with everyone.
I would add that app, that Power Africa app, though, has a link to all of the different organizations that are working in each of the countries. Okay, Carmen, should we go to another webinar? Participants' question?
Yes. This question comes from Holly Locus from Synergy Global Consulting, and I believe it's directed to Shrina. There is significant potential to stimulate economic development in the process of rolling out electricity infrastructure through strategic skills development and job creation, as well as local participation in projects through ownership. How is MCC planning to unlock these opportunities?
I think right now with our investments, we're taking the approach that I referenced already, which is to target first and foremost the utility and the existing parts of the grid that are underperforming and try to invest there. Though we were developing our second investment in Tanzania, which was going to be focused on energy, where we thought a little bit more, I think, about what the questioner was alluding to, which is productive use of electricity, and more than that term, just trying to think more about how people might actually take advantage of electricity and a cheaper form of energy, and how to encourage that. And so I think it's certainly something that we think about, and certainly if we were to invest again or consider investing again in grid extension, that's an area we would look into in a lot more depth, but I can't say anything concrete about that for our current investments.
Trina, I would, just like a tiny part of the Liberian Compact, with the gender and social inclusion component, there is some plans to do a little bit of kind of livelihood development among among women and marginalized populations. And we have been discussing doing some rapid cycle evaluation to just try and figure out if some of these different interventions, but very small scale, particularly compared to the investments going into the rehabilitation of Mount Coffee, the utility sector investments, and so forth. But there, I don't think that it's a small piece, but it does seem to still be there.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Williams Ojo. I'm a PhD student in Capital Technology University in Maryland, and also originally I'm from Nigeria in Africa. So the question I have basically is the issue of how do you have going forward in terms of your strategy, how to overcome the political driven electrification plan, because one of the key challenges you did mention was political consideration. And also from literature, I just want to give kind of suggestion that I've seen where GIS mapping has been used as a model to kind of look at the demographic strata or the socioeconomic status of people who have kind of demand for electrification, and using that as a lead to kind of influence the government of the country by putting it in a public domain in a transparent way, so that when you want to roll out or you want to extend the electricity, they will know that this is a public domain. Even the population, the people will know that this is the truth information here, right here in the public, because politics do, in most cases in Africa, influence, situations. Thank you.
I think in MCC's case, the one tool that we have to sort of bat away some of the political influences is that all of our investments have to be informed by an economic analysis and a cost-benefit analysis in particular. So, whereas the political imperative may point us to rural communities that are not electrified, which was kind of the case in the first Tanzania investment, which preceded, well, it didn't precede the use of the cost-benefit analysis, but preceded another piece of analysis that MCC uses, which is a growth diagnostic. So basically, when we start engaging with a country, the first thing that MCC does is, together with the country, to do a diagnostic to identify the binding constraints to economic growth. And so there, you'll get more information about what are the particular issues that are impeding growth in the country, and it's not usually connecting the last mile that usually comes up through that kind of analysis. And then secondly, we have the cost-benefit analysis, and we have a hurdle rate of at least a 10% economic rate of return. So again, that kind of moves us a little bit away from sometimes, a politician trying to advocate for electrifying his or her home village. It doesn't get us away from that completely, because another aspect of MCC's model is country ownership. So any decision-making related to the investment has to come from the country as well. But I would just say that trying to use our goal of economic growth and the tools that we have in place to design our investments helps us a little bit to focus on the economics and not the politics.
Can I maybe add something? Since you are mentioning a cost-benefit analysis and this as to inform like where to connect people, let me maybe play the advocate of the poor here, because
it's a trade-off, yeah.
Yeah, it's not just a trade-off, because I also think it depends on how you define and measure benefits. So I think electrification in rural areas, in particular, like the more remote, the more benefit basically you create in terms of like direct effect on well-being, if you want. And of course, this is very difficult to measure, and I called it earlier, maybe it even sounds esoteric, right, sometimes. But I do think it improves, people's well-being, and I think we have to take this into account when we talk about costs and benefits of electrification.
Yeah, it's something we struggle with, because if you only take the cost-benefit analysis, you would end up maybe only working in urban areas where you have the higher-paying customers. So yeah, it's something we debate on every country that we're working in.
It's good. Maybe just add in briefly there. Katie had a bullet on her slide about urbanization and how that's obviously happening very quickly in Africa. It does seem to me important to think about, when you're building out the grid, to what extent you might pull people in from rural areas who would have been poor if they remained there, might have better opportunities for work once they move. And it seems like that's going to be always a very tricky calculation.
Maybe go over here.
Thanks. I'm Steve Anderson from USAID. I thought I'd start with my USAID colleague Katie, but maybe Shrina, you want to chime in on policy and institutional reforms. I should know more about Power Africa than I do, but can you help me out, Katie? Does Power Africa work upstream at all in thinking of the structure, attention to competition, promoting competition, the regulatory framework in the electricity wholesale market, and also ultimately resale markets? And could you also comment on whether Power Africa is engaged on the role of a more competitive transmission regime. We talked mostly about distribution. This is mostly a distribution talk, but I think on the economics, not both nationally and also cross-nationally, not least in Africa, there are tremendous economies to be had from improved long-range power transmission, possibly even trans-border. Let's not do the hardest thing first. But could you comment a bit on kind of the upstream milieu and whether that might help us unpack some of these downstream problems and really, in a longer-term sense, get at a lot of the cost-effectiveness issues that we've been wrestling with?
Yeah,
Thanks.
That's a great question. So on the upstream kind of wholesale power supply, we do think a lot about competition. And there are, for those of you who are kind of maybe new to the power sector, we're seeing really great success around the world with all kinds of competitive processes like auctions and other structures that are helping countries procure energy at much lower prices than they have in the past. And it's not only because of the procurement structure, but also because the cost of solar is declining and the cost of other renewables keeps coming down. So that's a really exciting thing, that these countries may be able to procure power much cheaper. And countries like Ghana, for example, we're talking a lot about Ghana today, but Ghana very much wants to move to a competitive structure because over the past decade or so, they got themselves into a situation where there was so much pressure on the government to procure power really, really quickly that they ended up signing a lot of PPAs or agreements with generators at really high prices. And so they're trying to walk that back now and figure out how they can be competitive. You're seeing the same thing in Senegal, and countries like Zambia are working with the IFC and the World Bank. They just rolled out their first competitive procurement under a program called Scaling Solar. So we very much support those initiatives. And we actually just we published a book with the Commerce Department, bringing together a lot of experts and writing basically a guidebook to governments about how to think about competitive procurement and how to achieve some of those successes. And we're working with the E3 team within USAID to do a lot of that. But I think the kind of counterpoint to that is that in a lot of countries, they're maybe not ready for a fully competitive process. They've maybe never procured power from a private company before. And so we try to walk the line of supporting a country where they are and what they're ready for, and basically working towards ultimately competitive processes that are clear and transparent. And I would just add that one cool thing that the U.S. Trade and Development Agency is doing is that they have something called the Global Procurement Initiative. And so they're working with Ethiopia and I believe some other country to build life cycle costs into their procurement considerations, so that they're looking at they're making procurement decisions based on a much longer term, more comprehensive view of the value of a particular product.
Okay, do we have time for one more question?
We can do a quick one. Although I don't know if this one will be quick. It's from Amit Kher from ICF. What's the role of energy efficiency policies in providing reliable energy access in African countries?
I mean, talking about Ghana again, that is part of the Ghana investment. And so, just from the perspective of a lot of, not in every country, but in many of the countries that we work in, it boils down to demand exceeding supply, and then that resulting in all sorts of problems in terms of electricity service provision in the grid. And so that, of course, energy efficiency is a key factor to just trying to release more power for more people.
Yeah. Can I add something as well, really quick? It's huge in the off-grid sector, too. So I mentioned it briefly, but because the efficiency of appliances is coming down, an off-grid system that may be quite small is now able to provide actually more and more services with the same amount of power. So USAID recently supported a challenge that funded innovation in energy-efficient refrigeration that would work with off-grid systems. So trying to kind of make that connection and make sure that there are efficient ways to consume power that mesh with the off-grid technologies that are available.
Maybe just to add briefly, so I don't think in grid in grid extension programs, reliability is the big problem in rural areas. Not on the rural, and of course in urban areas it is, but not in rural areas. So I agree that for off-grid technologies, it plays a high role, but not so much in grid extension programs.
Yeah, and in Ghana, we will be doing some evaluation of that component, the energy efficiency component. So we're going to wrap up for today. I want to thank our panel very much for all of your contributions, as well as thank our audience for your questions and engagement, and our webinar participants. If you could, because we are a research organization, if you could fill out the electronic survey for those attending the webinar, we would appreciate that. All of everybody's bios and information is in the packet, so if you have additional questions, we welcome you to get in touch. And thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent.